This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 913 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by Underdog Fantasy. Thanks for tuning in. Underdog is the best and easiest place to play fantasy sports. And right now, if you sign up with promo code LATEROUND, like I've been saying, you get three things. You get a deposit bonus, you get a free pick, and you get a copy of my rest of season rankings. Those rankings are emailed to you after you sign up, and they're updated every Tuesday. All you have to do is head to UnderdogFantasy.com and use promo code LATEROUND when you sign up. Once you make a deposit, you'll get those three things. Again, that's promo code LATEROUND. Now let's get to these questions. The first question this week is from Patreon. It's from Matt. It says, "Hi JJ, why is Tank Dell ranked so high in your rest of season rankings?" So I got a lot of questions about Tank Dell this week. And because of that, because so many people are questioning him, and because of other reasons that I'm going to talk about right now, he's kind of an obvious buy candidate. So far this season, Tank Dell has run a route on 86% of Houston's dropbacks. Stephon Diggs, 87%. Nico Collins, 88%. People have this idea in their head that Tank Dell is Houston's wide receiver 3, which I guess is technically true. From a real life perspective, it is true. He's played like 20 fewer snaps across 2 games than Nico Collins and Stephon Diggs. But that doesn't matter that much from a fantasy football perspective, because we're not playing in points per cornerback blocked leagues. We're getting points for receiving, and Dell is still running routes at a similar rate as Nico Collins and Stephon Diggs. In a small sample size, we're going to see some wild fluctuations in production. Nico Collins is an alpha who's almost definitely going to lead that team in target share. But Dell currently has a 17% target share, Collins is at 28%. I don't think that's necessarily going to remain as large of a gap throughout the entire season. We didn't see nearly that kind of gap last year when Dell was a rookie. Now, players develop, and maybe Dell's not 100% after his injury last year. But this is a high-powered offense, and Dell is running a lot of routes within that offense, and he's still seeing targets down the field. According to Sports Info Solutions, Dell's 13th among relevant wideouts in intended air yards per target. His average up to target is still the highest on the Texans. The NFL is filled with terrible offenses right now. I'll gladly take on a second-year wide receiver who's getting a lot of run and one of the better ones. One of the few good offenses in the league. That's why Dell is still ranked pretty high in my rest of season rankings. This next question is also from Patreon. It's from David. It says, "I'm sure you'll get a lot of questions about the Miami wide receivers, your stance on them, and is there any chance we can get something out of a trade with name value?" Look, regarding that last question, in situations like these, valuations are going to be all over the place. So the only thing I can say is test the market. But I'm definitely concerned about the Miami pass catchers. Tyreek Hill has been in Miami since 2022. During that 2022 season, Tua missed 4 games. He also missed a playoff game that Skylar Thompson started in. But in those 4 games, Tyreek Hill averaged 15.7 PPR points per game. That's not that bad. But one of those games saw him with nearly 30 PPR points. He had 15 targets. And that game had Teddy Bridgewater throwing the ball because he came in for Thompson, who hurt his thumb. Now, Waddle had a good game that week too. But Waddle's splits are even more concerning. He averaged 10.2 PPR points per game in that 4-game split. Now, I'm not saying that those 4 games are everything, and all of a sudden Jalen Waddle is going to be like a wide receiver 5, or that Tyreek Hill is going to average exactly 15.7 PPR points per game. My point is more so the fact that quarterback play matters. We should be concerned about Miami pass catchers seeing a dip in production. Thompson has now started 3 games when you include that playoff loss to the Bills. He's thrown the ball 89 times in those starts. Again, one of those starts he got hurt. His yards per attempt rate on those 89 attempts is 5.2. Bryce Young's rookie season yards per attempt, 5.5. Tua's career yards per attempt is 7.7, and it's been 8.9 and 8.3 the last 2 years with Tyreek Hill. I mean, statistically, it's hard to see this as anything but a huge downgrade. The hope that you have to have for these pass catchers is that Miami just hits a lot of negative game scripts, which would increase their volume. We saw that in the playoffs against the Bills. Thompson had 45 pass attempts. The problem, He only completed 18 of them. So my stance is that I'm incredibly nervous about both Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. This next question is from Patreon. It's from Jesse. It says, another player I'm concerned about is Terry McLaurin. I was very optimistic about his connection with Jaden Daniels, but his lack of production is scaring me. I'd hate to get to week 4 and see Terry as a bench play. So I want to kick this off by reading a great tweet that came from my friend Rich Rebar at Lord Reeves this week. It said, 37.9% of Washington wide receiver targets have come behind the line of scrimmage, the highest rate in the league. The league average is 11.3%. That's pretty freaking wild. Washington has targeted their wide receivers at a 54% rate this year. That's about 6 percentage points lower than the average. Now, McLaurin himself has about a 23% target share, which is fine, but it's in an offense that's likely going to be a little bit more inefficient through the air. They've got a rookie quarterback. We're going to need a higher target share for McLaurin to be really good in fantasy football. But a 23% target share could definitely be worse. McLaurin's also in the top 15 in air yard share among all wide receivers across the league. He's been a wideout on that team who's actually getting down the field. His catchable targets rate, according to PFF, it's also not been that bad. Now, the problem is McLaurin just isn't connecting on any of his down the field targets. According to Sports Info Solutions, McLaurin has seen 4 targets this year that have traveled 10 or more air yards. There were 100 intended air yards on those throws. He caught one of those passes for 12 yards. Now, it's not Amari Cooper levels of bad. Cooper has seen 7 of those targets, and he's caught 0 of them. But it's still a huge reason that we're seeing little production out of Terry McLaurin. And some of that should regress. But McLaurin's ADOT so far this year, his average at the target, is down 3 full yards year over year. That just goes back to Rich's tweet. The Commanders need to push the ball down the field more, which we have to hope happens as Jaden Daniels develops. So I'm concerned. But this is why we typically don't see huge monster seasons from wide receivers with rookie quarterbacks. Because coaches are understandably not going to let them loose. It takes time for those quarterbacks to develop. I could see McLaurin being more of a second half of the season player than a first half of the season one. This next question is from Twitter. It says, how worried should we be about Dalton Kincaid rest of season? So I'm going to answer an even larger question about tight ends here in a minute, but I'll start with Kincaid first. My concern with Dalton Kincaid is twofold. Number one, his average depth of target right now is minus 0.6. That's according to PFF. And that's an absolute joke. You could see the Bills trying to get him involved more in week 2. That's great. But then that game script just got totally out of hand. Buffalo didn't need to throw the ball anymore. Like, a legit concern that I have about the pass catchers in Buffalo right now is that the Bills are just seeing game scripts that are really favoring the run. So far this season, Buffalo has the 27th ranked overall pass rate. Now, fortunately, they've been more pass heavy in neutral scripts. Their pass rate over expected is 18th in the league. That's not that bad. But Joe Brady did this last year. He's doing it again this year. He's not afraid to run the football. The hope would be that Buffalo's defense doesn't play all that well for fantasy purposes. Obviously, Buffalo fans want them to play well, but they've been pretty good through 2 games. Now, I don't think this is all going to continue through the end of the season. Kincaid is going to get more down the field targets, but it is a concern. If Kincaid has a low average depth of target, and if that's combined with a non-elite target share, like a target share below 20%, and that's in an offense that might be more run heavy than pass heavy, he absolutely will not live up to expectation. Like, even if you remove the first 2 games, his route participation hasn't been that bad, but we need to see a change here in week 3 to his usage, or else I'm going to be very panicked. Because at least right now, you can say week 1 was just tough for him, and then week 2's game script got out of hand. But if we get a week 3 game where Buffalo's game script is totally normal, they throw a normal number of pass attempts, and Kincaid is still being used this way, he's seeing his targets behind the line of scrimmage, then anyone with Kincaid could be in trouble. Now, the last one this week is kind of a long answer, but I think it's very, very interesting. It's from @Adam956938270005 on Twitter. It says, coming into the season, everyone was touting that this is the most balanced the top 10 tight ends have been. How does the expectation meet up with reality, and how are you projecting / expecting this to change as the season progresses? Okay, so let's talk tight end. I thought drafting tight ends in like round 4, round 5 this year, I thought it made sense. Because historically, we'd almost always seen a tight end, even ones not named Rob Gronkowski or Travis Kelce, we'd almost always seen some cluster of tight ends give us an advantage in fantasy football. And those tight ends often came from the top of your drafts. This year, we were getting a discount on those players. And to me, it was easy to take on that kind of opportunity cost. A second round opportunity cost, that's kind of rough. A 4th round one, a 5th round one, maybe even a 6th round one, that's a totally different story. The kind of hit rates at wide receiver and running back in those ranges are totally different. The problem so far is that every tight end basically sucks. But I have some thoughts on this. First, I think part of the problem, just the narrative here, is that people were assuming that every tight end that was drafted early was going to pan out. That was never going to happen. I talked about that a lot during the summer. It was always about probability and seeing if you were able to find the guy. The 2024 season, though, has gotten off to a really, really rough start for tight ends, at least compared to other seasons over the last decade. If you look at all top 10 tight ends by ADP since 2014, and you remove the tight ends who failed to play at least one game over their first 2 games, from 2014 to 2023, the average PPR points per game from those top 10 tight ends by ADP has been around 11.9. In other words, a top 10 tight end after 2 weeks has usually provided around 11.9 PPR points per game. This year, with a lot of guys removed because David Njoku and Evan Ingram and Jake Ferguson have been hurt, this year's average is 8.1, significantly lower than 11.9. Now that sample, to be fair, doesn't include Brock Bowers. I stopped at top 10 via Fantasy Data's ADP, and Bowers was tight end 11. But this is actually something that we saw last year too. Doing this exact same method showed the top 10 tight ends under 8 PPR points per game after week 2 last season. Now last year was a bad year for top tight ends, but a lot of those guys did bounce back to some degree. What I think is more interesting though is when you take another step back. The NFL has seen really bad offensive production to start the year. We're sitting here saying that tight ends suck, but literally every position sucks. Let me put it to you this way. I'm looking at the last 11 seasons with this ADP data. So we'll look back to 2014. Since 2014, so out of 11 seasons, across the first 2 weeks, quarterbacks have scored the 10th fewest fantasy points. Only 2017 was worse. Running back scoring ranks 8th. Wide receiver scoring ranks 10th. And then tight end scoring ranks dead last in 11th. So while these top tight ends have not performed well, it's really that no tight end is performing well. I mean, aside from a couple of them. Now, I was interested in digging into this a little bit more. So I looked at 3 main production buckets. And this data is all on Twitter, by the way, at LateRoundQB. I made a thread on it. But the first bucket was tight end target share. Are tight ends being targeted less than they were the previous 10 seasons? And the answer to that is kind of, but not substantially. Tight ends have seen a target share of 19.8% so far this year. That average through 2 weeks from 2014 to 2023 has been 20.2%. So technically, yes, the target share is lower, but not by much at all. It's basically been average. The good news is that since 2014, every single season aside from 2014 saw tight end target share increase when looking at week 3 through the end of the year. So we should expect an increase in tight end target share moving forward. The second chunk that I wanted to look at was percentage of wide receiver and tight end PPR points. In other words, I was taking all of the receiving PPR points in the league at tight end and wide receiver and seeing if maybe some of these points were going to wideouts instead of tight ends. In short, they kind of are. 22.5% of the tight end and wide receiver PPR points have gone to tight end so far this year. That's the lowest that we've seen since 2014, but it's only 0.3% off of last year's rate. And what's interesting is what happens to this number when looking at week 3 to week 18. It regresses. The seasons where that number was really, really high in week 1 and week 2, where tight ends were seeing a larger proportion of tight end and wide receiver PPR points, in those seasons, we saw a decline during weeks 3 to week 17 or week 18, depending on the year. But then in seasons where that number was lower, like in 2022 and 2023, we saw giant jumps. I'm talking like jumps of like 4 percentage points. So here's what that means. As we get more into the season, expect tight ends to score a higher percentage of the receiving fantasy points across the league. So with those two things, we're concluding that number one, tight ends should see a higher target share moving forward. And then number two, they should see a higher proportion of the receiving fantasy points moving forward as well. That's great news. The last thing I looked at was touchdown share, the percentage of touchdowns that were going to tight ends through the air. From 2014 to 2023, the lowest mark that we saw through the first 2 weeks was in 2018. 17.9% of receiving touchdowns went to tight ends. And if you look at the raw numbers, the lowest number of tight end touchdowns in weeks 1 and 2 was 16. 16 raw tight end touchdowns. This year, the tight end touchdown share is 11.8%. That's more than 6 percentage points lower than any other season. And tight ends have 8 touchdowns. 8. That's half of the lowest number since 2014. We know that touchdowns regress. And we've seen that happen through the years. For example, there were 3 seasons where after 2 weeks, tight end touchdown shares were above 30%. Those were in 2014, 2015, and 2020. When looking at week 3 to the end of the season for those 3 seasons, the drop in tight end touchdown shares were by 9.2 percentage points, 7.3 percentage points, and 8.1 percentage points. Meanwhile, every other season saw an increase in tight end touchdown share when comparing weeks 1 and 2 to week 3 through the end of the season, which is literal regression. This is what I mean by regression in small samples. Touchdowns tend to regress to the mean, and I would expect that to happen once again this year. So what that means is that within the context of this season, where offenses have been really bad, tight ends are slightly underperforming. Their target share is a little bit lower, their percentage of receiving points is slightly lower as well. But that can very easily normalize with regression, especially once they start scoring a higher percentage of the league's passing touchdowns. We can't guarantee a bounce back because every player and every season is unique. And maybe there's something going on here that's just different about 2024 than what we realize right now. But it's pretty reassuring to know that at a high level, when looking at trends, this season hasn't been nearly as abnormal as you might think. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribe to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. I greatly appreciate it. I've got a Late Round Perspectives episode dropping later this morning. Hope you give that a listen. Otherwise, good luck in week 3. I'll talk to you next week.